This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. Let's begin. We were extremely happy when it became dark. As usual, the Russian bomber formations flew past us and bombarded the city of Narva and our bridgehead. The city had probably already been leveled to the ground. Whenever the fires lit up the evening sky to our rear, we could hardly believe that there was still anything flammable left. The night was so dark that we couldn't see our hands in front of our eyes. I had a portion of the crews dismount with their machine pistols so that they could provide cover to the left and right of the road a short distance away. Ivan would have been able to easily surprise us in the tank since we couldn't see his approach. With Kursk and Sveti, I went back to the assembly area where our supply staff brought up munitions, fuel, and food. From that point on, the troops were supplied by APCs. The can-do attitude of these men from Grossdeutschland and their leader, Lieutenant Famula, was magnificent. No matter how often I went to their bunker with a request during those nights, I never heard anyone curse when he was torn away from his sleep and once again had to drive to us up front. Kursk brought the munitions and fuel up front, based on the reported needs of the individual tanks. I followed with the engineer squad, which had loaded the beams for the anti-tank ditch. The Russians were scarcely firing their heavy weapons anymore. An occasional machine gun to the right and left of the road could be heard. Wild confusion reigned behind the Russian lines as far forward as the anti-tank ditch. Ivan was exploring the area with numerous reconnaissance patrols. Often we yelled at someone who was standing in our way and didn't realize it was a Russian until he took off. Of course, none of us let himself get involved in a firefight. But despite that, or perhaps because of it, the night was especially unnerving. The Russians must have been interested in snatching one of us, and this certainty sufficed for us to practice the greatest of caution. In the afternoon we had wanted the nightfall. During the night, we waited impatiently for the morning. At least then we could see what was going on in our immediate proximity, whereas in the darkness, the men were running back and forth, the APCs were moving about, and the Russians were interspersed among them. For that reason, we could not begin any firefights. We were afraid of hitting one of our comrades. We'd already had enough bad experiences with that. During the early morning hours of April 20th, the Führer's birthday, the anti-tank ditch had been leveled and the T-34 prepared for demolition. Our engineers had packed everything imaginable into it, so that it actually would disappear from the road after the demolition. We therefore preferred to get back into our tanks for a short time. The engineers had called out to us while moving by that the demolition fuse was already burning. The thing flew apart with a murderous explosion. We assumed that Ivan would come to life after that, but nothing appeared to stir him. He had time and knew how strong he was. I made my way to the command post once again to discuss the operation with the commander of the Fusilier Battalion. Graf Strachwitz allowed himself to be disturbed during the night only by exceptional circumstances. Lieutenant Famula reported that the Graf was sound asleep and in pajamas as usual. Famula added that he only rarely allowed himself to be talked out of doing that. It couldn't really be that bad, Famula said, if the Graf was showing such calmness. Because the Graf wasn't there, we discussed matters with the battalion commander. At H hour, a Nebelwerfer regiment was supposed to fire a 5-minute barrage on point 312. The observer could employ the artillery according to our wishes. In the meantime, the infantry battalion had already arrived at our positions. It was in the ditches along the road left and right of the tanks and waited for the attack order. I looked at my watch somewhat nervously. That was probably about 5 minutes before the initiation of the preparatory fire. We were already warming up the engines. None of us felt quite right. Everyone had thought to themselves that the Graf would call off the operation during the night. That would have saved us a lot of men and materiel, but it turned out that we would have to wait on an hour-by-hour basis for 2 complete days for the order to withdraw. At H hour, we heard the howling caused by the punctual firing of the Nebelwerfer batteries behind us. I was just about to observe where the fire fell when terrible detonations made the earth shake all around us. It appeared that all hell had broken loose. All of the hatches flew open because of the air pressure. We had the feeling that our lungs would burst. My first thought was that Ivan had monitored our radio traffic and had started their attack at the same time we did. Unfortunately, that was a false conclusion. But how could I have known that our own Wonder Boys were shooting too short? Those unwelcome rockets with their deafening noise came at us from the rear. I had experienced the fire of a Stalin organ often enough, but compared to what happened there at the time, the Russians were rank amateurs. I immediately radioed the command post, but without success. Once the command to fire was given, then the planned salvo was fired off. Only rarely did we succeed in stopping it. We thus had to endure those terrible 5 minutes, and anyone who experienced them will never forget it. We were helpless in the barrage of our own Nebelwerfer. Even Ivan, if he had wanted to decimate our attack position, could not have shot better. I was never able to find out then or later how this miserable situation came about and who was responsible for it. The Nebelwerfer units had the same maps we did. It was a mystery how something like that could happen. When we were operating in the East Sack, I had requested rocket fire, and it had been denied because I had requested that it be fired 80 meters in front of us. The distance was considered too short. The same people now fired on their own accord right on top of us. Unfortunately, we couldn't talk to them to hold them accountable because the Nebelwerfer units quickly displaced and disappeared after every fire mission. That way, Ivan couldn't return the favor. After this incident, I could very well understand his feelings in that regard. As a result of the screw-up, the infantry battalion was smashed to pieces. Most of the men were wounded or dead. It was a gruesome sight. The neatly arranged beams in the anti-tank ditch had also been decimated. Despite all that, I got over to the other side of the ditch without problems. I set up with 3 tanks, so the Russians couldn't seriously interfere with the evacuation of the wounded and dead infantrymen. Lieutenant Famula immediately sent a few APCs forward to load the wounded. We thought the time had finally come to give up our intentions. Instead of that, an order was sent. Determine whether you can advance. A new battalion is being sent to you. Some may consider that insanity or, depending on the times, a crime, but one can't judge the requirements of such a critical defensive battle from a civilian or peacetime perspective. As a minimum, I wanted to reach point 312 to have a better jumping-off point for an attack south the next morning. At the same time, it was also completely clear to me that we could never reach the Narva. Ivan had long since mined the road through the woods. We moved out but only a short distance. A tank had already become disabled, and the road had to be cleared again. I wanted to light up a cigarette. Kramer gave me a light, and at the same moment a solid hit shook our tank. It must have been a colossal caliber fired by an assault gun. This time, however, it came from the Russian side. The guns were located on the high ground to the left of us. The men to my rear had already identified the target and took it under fire. The entire commander's cupola had flown off my Tiger. I had shrapnel in my temple and face. The wounds bled profusely, of course, but nothing had happened otherwise. The entire affair could have turned out considerably worse. Kramer had always chastised my smoking, but he had been taught a lesson. If I hadn't bent over to light up my cigarette, then my head would have been in the cupola at the critical moment. It hardly needs to be mentioned that I would have lost my head in the truest sense of the word. I wouldn't have been the first one that had happened to. The reason could be found in a design failure. On the initial Tigers, the cupola was still welded. It rose up high and had direct vision slits. The cupola hatch stood up vertically when it was opened. Thus, from a distance, anyone could recognize that the tank was vulnerable from the top. A high explosive round only had to hit the hatch, and the entire charge then came down on the commander's head. If a commander wanted to close the opened hatch, he had to lean over on the outside of the vehicle and expose himself to the hip to unhitch a safety latch that released it. This faulty design was soon changed. Thereafter, the cupola was rounded off. The commander looked indirectly through the vision slits with mirrors, and the hatch could be swung right horizontally and closed. The round that hit had ripped off the cupola right at the weld line. I was very lucky because if the round had hit somewhat higher on the hatch, I wouldn't have got off so easily, despite the saving grace of the cigarette. To finally get out of the Russian line of sight, we moved rapidly to point 312, which then meant that we were in the woods. I turned to the right to cover the path that ran into our road from the north. It was intended that the tank following me would provide security to the south. I immediately identified a Russian assault gun to the north and had my gunner take aim. Ivan bailed out, however, when he noticed that we were laying our sights on him. Kramer fired, and at the same time, another Russian assault gun hit us between the turret and the hull. The following tank had not reached point 312 yet. It remains a mystery to me how we got out of our Tiger. In any case, it happened as fast as lightning. We gathered in the ditch. I still had my headphones on, the only thing we saved. Naturally, we quickly disappeared into the next Tiger. The column started to move back to the anti-tank ditch, covering to all sides. In the process, another tank was knocked out and had to be pushed into the marsh to the left of the road. We intended to recover the damaged tank later. As one could imagine, we were fed up with everything. If the Russians had kept the overall situation in mind and waited a little bit longer to fire, we all would have certainly come back on foot. That marked the conclusion of our birthday present to the Führer. After moving back, we didn't suffer any more losses. In the meantime, the Graf had pulled a battalion out of our old front line to cover us. The Kampfgruppe, which had advanced from the north, also got hung up. According to reports from its command, the Kampfgruppe advancing to the south of us had reached the road between Point 312 and the town on the Narva. That was probably also the reason why we had to continue to wait. Perhaps they could have opened up the road from that location. On the next day, we knocked out 2 enemy tanks during a Russian counterattack. Our damaged Tiger had to be blown in place by the engineers because it could not be recovered. On April 22nd, we moved our positions a little bit forward to make possible the towing of the second tank. The Tiger was towed back during the night. The Russians didn't hold back on their ammunition anymore once they knew that our operation had failed. We received a few hits from anti-tank guns because both exhaust pipes of our tank were glowing red and offered a good target. We dropped the one Tiger in front of the ditch. Further to the rear, we picked up Carpenetto's disabled tank. The Russian lame duck biplane considerably disrupted our movement to the rear. The superb Lieutenant Famula also fell victim to one of these bombs. He was surprised by one and mortally wounded by shrapnel while standing on the road. We finally reached our assembly area in good shape. We set up there in case of a Russian counterattack. At the same time, the infantry went back to its old positions. Von Schiller, together with Oberfeldwebel Delzeit, moved forward to recover another disabled vehicle. While mounting up, a piece of anti-tank shrapnel sawed out Delzeit's hindquarters. He vented his spleen by continuously cursing up a storm. The Tiger we had left on the far side of the ditch also had to be blown in place because the infantry could not hold out under the Russian pressure. They had to withdraw that same night. That was the way the third Operation Strachwitz ended. We didn't gain 1 yard of ground, but sacrificed many soldiers and tanks in the process. Our operations in the northern sector of the Eastern Front, especially the last few ones along the Narva, hadn't made us happy despite the successes we had gained. Everyone realized, however, that our presence had been desperately needed. The infantry by itself was simply too weak to fight against such a superior foe. We had to reinforce the front by becoming the stays in the corset. Just the psychological support that only we could often provide sufficed to keep our ground pounders from giving up. Unfortunately, the losses sustained by indirect fire as a result of too much milling about were too high. The mechanical problems in the marshy terrain also occurred more frequently than usual. Proper tank terrain, where an entire company could be employed as a unit, was a seldom sight in the pathless areas of the north. Because of that, we often had to fill the vacancy of the missing defensive weapons. "The spirit of armor is the spirit of cavalry," a former company commander of mine used to say. He, like many tank officers, came from the cavalry. This comparison is very apt and demonstrates how the employment of tanks requires the room to maneuver, something which was never available in that sector. Only by attacking and counterattacking were we fully able to use our maneuverability and the long range of the 88mm cannon. In the northern sector, where Ivan was always eluding us, we could only rarely inflict serious damage on him. Without our presence, however, the Narva sector could not have been held at all. We made every effort possible to come to terms with the difficulties of the terrain and, in the process, approached the limits of what was humanly possible. Even if we often cursed about vegetating in the marshy terrain, We were proud that the infantry had confidence in us and was, by and large, satisfied with us. The final, Operation Strachwitz, was our farewell performance in the Narva sector. We assembled at our support base in Silima. Most of the tanks were being repaired and had to be overhauled from the ground up. Fortunately, Ivan also appeared to need some rest, and there was no major fighting in the following few weeks. This concludes the 16th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.